Couple days ago, I posted part 1 of my epic ranking of all 45 theatrically released DC movies. In that video, I looked at the 15 worst DC movies. Today, we're moving along to part 2 of this series, looking at the 15 middle-of-the-road DC films, the ones that are kind of good and kind of not so good at the same time. So let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share some of your picks for the middle-of-the-road DC films, the movies that you kind of enjoy, but you know there's some problems there. Also, remember to come back in a couple of days when I release part 3 of this series with the 15 best DC movies. With that said, let's get started. Kicking off the top 30 is Batman Forever, the first Batman film directed by Joel Schumacher. I think improves upon a couple of the weaknesses of the Tim Burton Batman films, but makes a bunch of mistakes of its own. On the positive side, the movie actually focuses in on Bruce Wayne as the central character and does some interesting exploration of the psychology of Bruce and Dick Grayson. There's similarities and their differences, and it can get overlooked a little bit because the movie is so campy in tone. There is a good bit of action and some of it is well done. But of course, the Joel Schumacher Batman films are infamous for how campy they are. Certainly this one isn't as bad as Batman and Robin, but right off the bat, this movie kicks off with a joke about Batman getting drive-through.
Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?
I'll get drive-through.
And some ideas were so bad that Batman the Animated Series actually made fun of this movie in an episode.
Hey, who's talking about Batman? I love Batman. All those muscles, the tight rubber armor, and that flashy car. I heard it can drive up walls.
Yeah, sure, Joel.
But honestly, while the campiness hasn't aged all that well, that's not why the movie is this far down on the list. The storytelling here is very choppy, and it's just like a series of things happening with no setup or natural connection between them, and the sequences could happen in any particular order. And then in the middle of the film, Bruce Wayne decides to stop being Batman while there's a crisis involving 2 different supervillains, and the movie doesn't fully explain why he becomes Batman again, as if a subplot had been removed. Because a subplot was removed. The DVD and Blu-ray have a bunch of deleted scenes of this subplot, and there's rumors of a much darker 3-hour cut of the film. And given how choppy the storytelling is here, I'm not surprised by that at all. When you put it all together, it's much better than Batman and Robin, but because they decided to cut out all the drama and serious stuff and just focus on the goofiness, it feels like a very dated product of its time. Number 29, Batman 66. After the wildly successful debut of the 1960s TV show, they decided to do a theatrical film where Batman faces all of his main rogues gallery. And it is exactly what you'd expect. A very campy version of Batman with puns, slapstick, and goofy riddles. The 2 standout sequences are the beginning one where Batman has a shark caught on his leg and the part later in the movie where he's trying to get rid of a bomb.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
Your ability to enjoy this movie is tied directly to either how much you enjoy puns or whether you grew up watching the 1960s TV show. If you grew up on The Dark Knight, you will be baffled by this film. As for me, I grew up watching reruns of the old show on Nick at Night. I have a ton of nostalgia for this movie, which I had on VHS, as well as that TV show. It's not amazing cinema. It is just a feature-length version of the TV show, but it does what it's going for relatively well. Granted, what it's going for feels ancient in the year 2021. Next up, Swamp Thing. Now, this is a movie I watched for the very first time while prepping this video, but because I spent so long prepping this video, I've actually watched it twice at this point in time. Now, this is a movie that's enjoyable largely for the novelty of seeing a superhero story through the lens of legendary horror director Wes Craven. It's very much an old-fashioned creature feature with people in rubber suits, kind of goofy, campy action sequences while taking itself very seriously. And there's something charming about this type of story if you're into kind of older monster movies and that kind of thing. Some of the storytelling here, I think, is a little bit off, where at the beginning, it's not entirely clear who we're supposed to be following, who's the good guy, who's the villain, and the main villain is introduced through exposition and then just kind of shows up through a mask reveal later on in a way that was a little bit confusing to me both times that I watched the film. But in general, a movie that's decent enough, interesting enough to see a superhero movie in the early phases of the genre, in particular because it is directed by Wes Craven. It's more of an intrigue for me than a movie that I would naturally gravitate to rewatch generically on its own, but one I'm glad I've seen. Coming in at number 27 is Red. This goofy action comedy is fun but forgettable. The big appeal here is seeing all of these fantastic actors and actresses playing these over-the-top characters. They're all having a ton of fun, so the audience is having fun with them. But it's also the kind of movie where you remember the premise, the energy, the vibe, more so than specific plot points. Like, I watched the movie less than 2 weeks ago, and I don't really remember what the plot was or what exactly was going on. Part of the reason for that is there's also way too much going on, way too many subplots, way too many comedic subplots where they're just trying to squeeze more actors into the movie, so it gets a little bit convoluted. But some of that doesn't matter. The movie just exists to entertain. Not every joke lands, but they're all played with so much energy that it's charming nonetheless. It's a movie that if it's ever on, I wouldn't mind rewatching it, but it's not a movie that I remember to rewatch on its own. Number 26, Superman Returns. For nearly 20 years, they were attempting to make a fifth Superman movie. Most notably, in the late 90s, Tim Burton was going to make a movie called Superman Lives that was going to star Nicolas Cage.
What was wrong with the original costume was that he wore his underpants on the outside.
Then a few years later, there was a different version called Superman Flyby that J.J. Abrams wrote. All of that fell through, and instead, they brought on Bryan Singer, the director of X-Men 1 and 2, to make Superman Returns, which was kind of a quasi-sequel to Superman 1 and 2. The end result is occasionally great, but it's largely a misguided attempt to make an homage to a bygone era of comic book movies. And in doing so, there's a certain elegance to the way the movie is directed. A couple of the action sequences are great, in particular the plane rescue sequence. But at the same time, it just feels like a movie 20 years too late. Superman in the comics, as well as in TV shows, had moved beyond this old-fashioned version of Superman and Lex Luthor. So when you have Lex Luthor as this villain who's super goofy, campy, and wants to do a bunch of real estate schemes, it just feels ancient by the time this movie came out. Beyond that, there's not nearly enough action in the film. In the end, it's a very polished, slick production that's very respectful to past Superman films, but it was the wrong idea to execute at the time and simply didn't have enough action. Then we have The Losers, another star-studded, energetic action film that a lot of people didn't realize was based off a DC property. Part of what makes this one fun is when this movie came out, actors like Chris Evans weren't household names yet. They were up-and-coming actors, but they hadn't risen to the level of stardom that they currently have been since joining the MCU. Now, this movie has charisma oozing out of it because everyone has so much on-screen presence that they're just fun to watch. It's a lively movie with a bunch of lively characters, and that's kind of what elevates a movie that can feel very familiar. The basic plot and setup here seems like an alternate version of the A-Team. Likewise, there's a couple problems in the tone, whereas the setup for the film involves a bunch of kids getting murdered, but then it's also a very jokey, light film, and I don't think the two tones quite mesh entirely. Likewise, there's a third act twist involving Idris Elba's character that felt like it kind of came out of nowhere with how sharply his character turns. And so it's a movie that's very watchable. There's a lot of enjoyment to be had, but there are a number of problems with the script and the tone itself. Number 24, The Dark Knight Rises, the epic conclusion to Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, certainly has lofty ambitions. There's some very interesting versions of these characters with some great performances.
Of course.
But I also think this is one of Christopher Nolan's most deeply flawed films. In order to tell a story as big and epic as Nolan was aiming for, he had to make certain sloppy mistakes in the script and storytelling that his movies are normally known for not making. There's also certain repeated plot points in the film where Batman becomes Batman only to have his back broken so he can become Batman again. There's just too many loose ends, contrivances, and shortcuts in order to pull the whole thing together. And what makes this so frustrating is that the great moments are just as great as in the previous two films. There's heartbreaking moments with Alfred between him and Bruce, or Alfred at Bruce's grave in the final moments. In general, the way it builds up and swells in the final moments absolutely works for me. But Nolan had to cheat a little bit to get there, and that's what's disappointing about this film. I want to like it more, I want to be able to engage with it more, but I think there's a few too many mistakes. Moving along, we have Batman Returns. With his second Batman film, Burton decided to double down on all the Burtonisms, in which case you get a movie that stands out as very distinct inside of the comic book movie genre, but I think it works better as a Tim Burton superhero movie than as a Batman story. Burton reinterprets Batman, Penguin, and Catwoman as these freaks and loners that actually have quite a few similarities, but it manifests themselves in different ways. In doing so, there's some interesting themes being explored here. Both Danny DeVito and Michelle Pfeiffer give just amazing standout performances. Danny Elfman's score is phenomenal. The production design stands out. It's interesting. It's fun to look at. But it's the story itself that I'm not sure entirely works here, where the central plot line involves Penguin coming up with this master plan where he's going to run for mayor, but when that doesn't work out, he plans to kill all the children. And it just doesn't fully come together. It just feels like it's trying to do too many things in under 2 hours. Likewise, much like Burton's first Batman film, Batman's not really the star of his own movie or the character that Burton seems most interested in.
Not a great plan.
So while there are some great elements here, and this movie was a big part of my childhood, it's not one that I rewatch a lot as an adult. Number 22, Constantine. Now, this is a movie I watched for the very first time just a couple of weeks back, and it's a nice little mix of noir, comic book movie action, and demons. What really sold this one for me is the world building and some of the designs that they went with. As you kind of see Constantine go into hell and explore that environment, I just thought it was done really nicely, and certain effects shots were pulled off in a way that I just thought looked very cool. On the flip side, Keanu Reeves seems horribly miscast as Constantine. Whoa. And I didn't like Keanu Reeves, and he's great in movies like this. He's just not this specific character. Likewise, it's a movie that I don't feel like it knew exactly how to pay off everything that it was doing. So the third act was actually my least favorite part of the movie because I didn't feel like they did proper villain setup, and all these characters just seemed to like show up at the end in a way that wasn't very satisfying and didn't pay off all that well for me. So it's a movie that I liked the journey, the world building, and the vibe more than the specific story itself. Next up, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, the Ultimate Edition. Had I gone with the theatrical cut for this list, it would have been much lower because that version is fairly incoherent. Zack Snyder's follow-up to Man of Steel is one of the most divisive superhero films of all time because some people think it is absolutely atrocious and pretentious, and other people absolutely love it. As for me, it's a movie that I have always enjoyed while finding it to be very flawed at the same time. What I really enjoy about the film is that it actually is trying to explore ideas, but because it's trying to explore those themes as a follow-up to Man of Steel while being a Batman v Superman movie and doing the death of Superman and bringing Lex Luthor into the mix and setting up Justice League, there's just too much going on in a single film and it has to get very convoluted to pull all of it together.
You've made a huge mistake.
And it's frustrating to me because there's so many scenes, sequences, or action bits that I just think are awesome, but the plot holding it all together is not as strong as it should be. Certainly, the good outweighs the bad here for me by quite a bit. But they were so close to brilliance and they didn't quite get there. We've made it to the top 20 with Teen Titans Go to the Movie. It's irreverent, immature, obnoxious, and a lot funnier than I was expecting. To state the obvious, this movie is not going to be for everyone. It will either annoy you or entertain you. And in my case, it entertained me quite a bit. From its send-ups of the comic book movie genre as well as the industry surrounding them, to the ultra-violent time travel sequence, to the many musical numbers, one of which includes Michael Bolton.
It's an upbeat inspired.
Its comedy worked for me. It just landed. To be clear, this is a movie I went into assuming I wasn't going to like it. And I found myself laughing from beginning to end. But if you give it a chance, if you can tolerate the insanity, it's a lot wittier than it has any business being. Number 19, Tim Burton's Batman, an iconic comic book movie that revitalized the genre and sparked my love for comic book movies. In fact, I still have my Batman trading cards right here. Danny Elfman's score is one of the best superhero themes of all time. The production design is cool looking and distinct and makes the movie absolutely pop and stand out. Jack Nicholson plays a very lively, classic version of the Joker. There's a lot here to love. Unfortunately, I think the aesthetics and casting are far better than the story and the storytelling. First off, the movie doesn't seem very interested in Batman or Bruce Wayne. He doesn't really join the story until about 30 minutes into the film, and Jack Nicholson's Joker certainly takes center stage. Second, the way the actual scenes and sequences play out are very episodic, where it's just kind of cutting between all of these little misadventures of the Joker, and they don't necessarily tie together or build forward momentum. And so it's a movie that was so pivotal to my childhood, a movie that I watched roughly 1 billion times growing up. I don't know that it's aged all that well, though. Real quick, before I give you the final 3 of this video, remember to join me down below in the comment section. What are your picks for the middle-of-the-road DC films? The ones that you kind of enjoy, but you also know are kind of flawed at the same time. Also, remember, this is part 2 of a 3-part series. You can check out part 1 right up here with the 15 worst DC movies, and come back in a couple of days, and I'll share my picks for the 15 best DC movies. Next up, Aquaman. Here, James Wan embraced the silliness of the character, and in doing so, made one of the most fun movies in the DCEU. It moves at breakneck speed from an origin story to a battle for a kingdom to a globe-trotting relic hunting film, and closes out with a big gigantic war involving sea monsters. James Wan is looking to entertain, and he's cooking with butter and sugar. There's no shortage of pop music, cheesy one-liners, heroic poses, people eating goldfish, people eating flowers. Anything that's cheap entertainment, it goes for it. But it's entertainment nonetheless. I can see where this could be a bit fishy for some of you.
I thought my jokes were bad.
But for me, I found its energy infectious. A big part of why it works is that the cast are having a lot of fun and embracing how cartoonish the movie is. In particular, Jason Momoa is just all in with the humor, the action, all of it. Another couple of nice touches here. James Wan shoots the action with wide angle shots and long takes so you can see what's taking place. And it's also a movie that has an actual big story unfolding about this kingdom with family heritages, betrayals. There's a bunch of kind of Shakespearean stuff thrown in there. It can be goofy, it can be campy, but it's entertaining. Number 17, V for Vendetta, a fascinating character study whose political themes are just as relevant today as they were 15 years ago when the movie came out, as well as when the graphic novel was written. In fact, some of this movie's kind of eerie when you're watching it in the year 2021 and a bunch of crises faced in the film mirror a bunch of stuff that's happened over the last year and a half. Hugo Weaving is great in the film, and he has a bunch of poetic dialogue that's so eloquently delivered.
Words will always retain their power. Words are for the means to meaning, and for those who will listen, the enunciation of truth.
The movie's a little bit more political thriller than action film. It's very much about this criminal investigation in intrigue. But when the action does happen, you can tell that the Wachowskis were involved in this production because it has their flair for visual spectacle. It's also a movie that feels like they squished 4 hours of plot into 2 hours. Now, they did a good job of squishing all the plot into 2 hours, but you can tell at certain points in time they're trying to rush through all the different pieces and putting the dominoes in place so they can tip them over in the finale. It's also a movie for me that gets better as it goes along. It doesn't immediately capture me, but as I get to know the characters, as it sets all the pieces up, the payoff is rather nice in the last 20 minutes. Closing out the middle 15, the Lego Batman movie. The Lego take on Batman turns out to be actually a very good take on the character. Superficially, it's just as wild and hyperactive as the other Lego movies. It is jam-packed with Warner Brothers properties with a bunch of cameos from all kinds of different franchises, but at its core, it's a very heartfelt Batman story. It understands the loneliness and contradictions of Bruce Wayne. It plays them for laughs, but it can also be very poignant at other points in time. Will Arnett is absolutely fantastic as this exaggerated version of the Caped Crusader, but across the board, the voice cast here are a ton of fun. The movie can be a little bit much for me because there's so much going on. There's so many laughs. There's so many heartfelt moments. There's so many cameos that it can be a little bit of sensory overload, but it's a great example of how to tell a wild story that both sends up and celebrates its lead character. Be sure to come back in a couple of days to find out the 15 best DC movies. You can find out the 15 worst DC movies right over there. Or if you want to see my ranking of all 58 Marvel movies, it's also right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.